Hi everyone, sorry about that. For some reason it is not connecting on Facebook, so I'm just going to do it here on Instagram and then post it on the Facebook group later. Tech. Okay, awesome. So I'm really excited because this is the first time I'm in my new house, apartment, and we finally have Wi-Fi, so this is the first time that I'm kind of doing this in my office space and feels all very official and yeah, so exciting. So this will be the first one. Thanks for joining today. If you're joining live, just give us a little wave, say hi. And I'd also love to know from you guys, what your sort of knowledge or experience is, not necessarily, sharing your trauma with us, but just in general, like the concept, the ideas around trauma. Is it something that you're very familiar with or not? Of course, in the spaces that I'm in now, I hear about trauma a lot, and I think it's also, it's something that comes up a lot more. It's become more wider knowledge, I guess, and sometimes a little bit of like a buzzword. I'm just curious whether it's something that you're quite familiar with and you've been hearing about and you've been learning about, or is it like, what is trauma even? So we're going to get into a little bit of like what trauma actually is and some of the misconceptions about it. And we're going to go into a few resources as well, and also just our role as clinicians, like how can we play a role in this? So let me know your thoughts as you are listening. Feedback is always welcome, and I'd love to hear what you guys think on these topics and how you might incorporate that into your practice as well. I was chatting to a clinician the other day, and she was saying it feels like the things that I coach on is like everything that we didn't learn at varsity, which is kind of true. I suppose everything except the clinical stuff. So I mainly work on the other stuff, right? The more personal, emotional side, the human side of being a clinician. And that's what really excites me, and that's what I think is so important for us as clinicians. We are humans going through this experience of being clinicians as well, right? So, and trauma is part of what makes us human, right? So just acknowledging the human side, the emotional side of being a clinician, I think is really important, and it's something that we don't do very naturally. We almost do the opposite, like we're trying to be not human, we're trying to have this like professional mirage. I think it's really important for us to start connecting with that side of things. So that's what I love to do. All the stuff we didn't learn at varsity, and all the more like human side of being a clinician. Okay, cool. So we're just going to start with like a general definition of trauma, because I think that's really an important place to start. So the Greek word that it's kind of that it's based on is the word for wound. So we just think of it as like your woundedness, right? So think about how your woundedness would affect your behavior, your interactions with other people, your way of seeing the world, your perspectives on the world, right? It's going to influence everything as you're moving through life, that woundedness. And I think the first misconception that we need to look at is that it's just about these like big traumatic events, like these things that everyone would look at and agree that those are terrible, right? Natural disasters, poverty, racism, abuse, all those kinds of things. And those are massive, right? Those are very we can clearly see that those are traumatic events. But I think in our kind of day-to-day lives, there's a more kind of, they call it like big T trauma, which is like those big events, those like very obvious. When you look back at your life, you might think of something very obvious that was traumatic for you. But then there's what they call little T trauma. So not with a capital T, but just a little t, which is often like smaller stuff that kind of builds up over your lifetime, or things that are maybe not something that you would immediately recognize as traumatic, like, you know, moving country, starting a new job, getting married. Those kinds of things we don't necessarily think of as traumatic, but they can influence our stress response in such a way that it activates that traumatic response within us. And then also that little t is, think about, trauma is not necessarily only bad things that are happening to you or happened to you, but it's also the absence of good things, the absence of healthy things, right? So, for example, even if your parents weren't abusive, but they were very kind of distant or neglectful, or they weren't very attuned to your emotional needs, or they were very emotionally up and down, right? So we need that kind of safe, secure, attuned parent, even if, so you can have the absence of that, which is still can be traumatic, even though there's no kind of event or something that they did that was bad. And then I think just related to that, I think we often think of, if I'm going to look at trauma and look at my childhood and look at my experiences, I'm going to be blaming people. And I think that's also important to realize that that's not what it's about. We're not trying to blame people, right? This is nobody's fault. We all do what we have capacity for at the time. And then related to that comment about it's not necessarily something bad happening, right? But if you are, for example, a single parent, you are by nature going to be stressed. You're going to be maybe less present. You're going to maybe be more up and down because you're worrying about this and worrying about that. You have to, you know, get things done. You're more worried about, like, how do I logistically parent with, you know, limited resources and still having to work and all of that, without ever being a bad parent or someone that, you know, abused their child or anything like that. So just getting that sort of clear. And if you go on that definition of like woundedness, and I think it's Peter Levine, one of the really sort of prominent people in this area. He just talks about anything that's too much, too fast, or too soon. So Britt Frank, another author, I'll put all these like resources and stuff for you guys, but she wrote a book called The Science of Stuck. And she was just saying that definition of like too much, too fast, too soon, essentially it's like your brain is overwhelmed, or it almost has like indigestion, right? It's like it's just too much, or it's like something that it doesn't agree with, even if it's not necessarily like bad. So just thinking of trauma as that, like almost brain overwhelm or like brain indigestion. Something happened too fast, too soon, too much, or not enough, right? And it overwhelmed your ability to actually cope with that. And that was internalized as a sort of stress response that your body stores in some way. And then when you meet a similar situation or something that triggers that same reaction in you, that response will sort of come out from that experience. So I'm just checking that I went through all the misconceptions. Then I think also with the, in addition to the blaming thing, we also sometimes think of of trauma being an excuse for certain behaviors, right? Like it's just a traumatic response. And I think the important thing to remember is that it's not about excusing behavior, it's just about explaining and understanding behavior. So often when behavior looks illogical or it just looks out of proportion to what is happening, right, we can then understand it through this frame, like, oh, this is the body's stress response to a perceived threat, even in the absence of the threat, or even in the absence of the sort of proportion of stress that we are, that you would assume that it is from our sort of stress response. There's another quote that says something along the lines of, if it's hysterical, it's probably historical. So if your reaction is very hysterical in the sense of like it's just it seems out of proportion to what's happening, very sort of feels out of your control, you just sort of like explode, that is probably something linked to what has happened previously. And I think it is Gabamate, he says trauma is kind of like summarizing what we spoke about, but trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you in response to that. And everyone can have a very different response to the same thing, right? People who are much more sensitive as children might respond very differently to someone who's not, right? So it is very personal. There's no sort of, what do you call it, like checklist of like, this is what will cause trauma in a person. That will always be different per person, and how they respond to it, how they think about it, how they internalize it, how they other perspectives kind of shape that. So just know that it's very kind of personal, it's different per person, and it's valid even if you at this point don't feel like it should have been traumatic. Or I think what we often do is, like, as adults, we'll look at something that happened when we were younger and we'll say, well, that wasn't that bad, right? But when you are a child and you're so small and you have no context for what's happening, you have no like emotional understanding, you have no or less reasoning ability, right? Things that are that look small to us now, looking back, then were really big, right? So just remembering that we experience things very differently as children than that we do now. Okay. And then I also just wanted to talk about the reason I'm talking about trauma in the context of like clinicians. And the first thing I want to say is, this is not me pretending to be like a mental health provider or expert, and that's also not what I'm suggesting that you do, right? So I'm not saying, oh, I can heal your trauma and come to me if you have trauma and we'll like sort it out or whatever it is. And also I'm not saying that you as a clinician now need to be that person that is going to heal your patient's trauma or kind of fix it in some way, or we now need to be more like therapists. I'm not saying any of that, right? What I'm saying is that we need to be more aware of trauma and its impact on our behaviors, on disease, etc. So there are a few things that I think that explain why it matters, let's say, for us as clinicians. So the first one is that it, like I said, explains our behavior. So it's this way to kind of frame illogical or seemingly illogical behavior. And this is not only about trauma, but just as a general thing, to always remember that our behavior makes sense. There is a reason that we behave in a particular way, right? So there's a reason why your patient says they want to get better, but then doesn't do their exercises, for example, right? So going from this place of behavior always makes sense, right? So not coming from what is wrong with you, this is to ourselves and not to our patients, right? Understanding that our own behavior makes sense, even when it seems illogical, even when we feel like, oh my gosh, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just ... or why can't the patient just ... right? It's a lens through which we can start to understand that better and to know that our behavior always makes sense. Okay, there's always a reason for that. And on that, we are always motivated, right? So there's no such thing as being lazy or unmotivated. We're always motivated. We're either motivated towards a particular goal or task, so goal-orientated motivation, or we are motivated to protect ourselves. And that's usually where we are calling ourselves lazy or unmotivated, is when we're in that protective response. So when your brain is overwhelmed or it perceives a threat or something triggers that stress response in it, it can feel very illogical. It can look like procrastination, it can look like freezing, it can look like doom scrolling for hours, it can look like indecision, it can look like perfectionism, right? So all these things that we sort of think about as like, why can't I just be better? Try harder. Those are usually things that we can explain using the stress response of our bodies. Okay. So that's the first thing, just understanding behavior better. The second thing is that we can think about ourselves being a parasympathetic cue for our patients, right? So are you the clinician who is making your patient feel seen and heard, right? Are you making them know? Do you make it known that you are not judging them, right? Do you provide a very non-judgmental space for them, right? And then being that parasympathetic cue for them, right? You can be the cue that allows them to relax, to soften, to open up a little bit, right? So noticing where we might be another like stress response to a patient, whether that's from like, oh, what's wrong with you? You said you wanted to get better and now you weren't doing exercises, or more from like just not letting them feel seen, making them feel like you're judging them for their lifestyle choices or their, how much pain they've been, how long they've waited before they came to see you, for example, like all these things, right? Are you judging them for these things? So just being that very safe space for our patients and being kind of a cue for their nervous system to calm down. And then related to that is for ourselves then, are we seeking out those spaces for us as well, right? Are you seeking out spaces that feel like they are activating the parasympathetic aspect of your nervous system? And sort of the healthy part of that, right? Because parasympathetic can also sometimes look like freeze. There's two aspects of our parasympathetic, and one looks more like kind of dissociating, freezing, etc. But I mean more in the sort of calm, less stressed, joyful kind of way of talking about the parasympathetic nervous system. So we want to seek that out for ourselves. We want to seek out non-judgmental spaces. We want to seek out spaces where we feel seen and heard and like understood, and that no one's going like, what is wrong with you, right? That is what we need to seek out for ourselves. And by the way, that is the kind of space that I really try and create with my community. So if that is a space that you're looking for, that you don't have that, come to our clinician gatherings. Those are specific for the lady clinicians, but then also the Facebook group, right? We talk about all these things, and because we are with people who get it, right? And I'm very strict on that as well, that there's no like judging and shaming and criticizing in these communities, right? So those kinds of spaces where you just feel safe, you feel heard, and you feel understood, and that no one's going to shame you for your behavior or your thoughts. Okay, and then the third reason that I think it's important for us as clinicians is we want to be aware of the link between things like our body's stress response and traumatic responses. We want to be aware of how that influences things like pain, influences things like disorders that our body then develops, right? So various symptoms. So we want to be really aware of that connection. And again, not because we're trying to then heal our patient's trauma, but we want to be aware when it's not purely physical. And even that sort of separation doesn't really make sense, but just that framing of like, remember that these things can have other influences. And I think that's often where the kind of very mechanistic approach, not only for this reason, but that's one of the reasons that can fall short sometimes. So just being aware of that, right? And if you want to dive into that a little bit more, you can look at psychoneuroimmunology or psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology. But yeah, people like Gabor Mate, people like Peter Levine, Bessel, van der Kolk also put all of these. These are all resources that you can go and look at and learn more about this kind of body-wide, system-wide response to stress and trauma. Okay, cool. There was one more thing. Oh, the last thing that I just wanted to talk about is that trauma can make us very disconnected from ourselves, and this is more sort of, this can be related to your patients, but I just wanted to mention something that I notice in us as clinicians. There's like some videos that are like, you know, our choice to be healthcare providers is a stress response, because helping is the way that we, you know, gain acceptance, that we think that that's our role in the world, that we need to be helping and fixing and saving. So that's interesting just on its own. But just thinking of, hey Marjorie, just thinking of trauma as reminding ourselves that trauma has an effect that it disconnects us. It disconnects us from our bodies, especially if it's very sort of physical trauma. We dissociate from our bodies, so we might not be aware of our physical sensations. We might not be aware of our physical needs because we have this dissociating physically. We might dissociate from our own needs and desires. Does that sound familiar? Not knowing what we want, not being able to ask for what we need because we don't even know what we need. So being very sort of disconnected and having that distance from oneself in some sense. And one of the things that is often talked about with trauma is that we have two fundamental needs, and that the one is for authenticity, being able to express ourselves, being truly ourselves, and the other need is for attachment, right? So when we are children, we have those two fundamental needs, right? And ideally, both of these can be expressed simultaneously, right? That we can be authentic, we can express our needs, we can express our emotions, we can talk about our thoughts, and we can maintain that attachment to our primary caregivers, right? So we can have that connection, we can have that love, we can have that affection. It's not jeopardizing the relationship, right? But what often happens is that there's some message that who we truly are or what we need or want is in some way negatively affecting that primary caregiver relationship, right? So sometimes it's inconvenient, like I was talking about, you know, a single mom really doesn't have time to, like, you know, listen to every like thought and emotion. I mean, obviously not every single parent doesn't have the time to do this, but I'm just thinking of, like, you know, single parent who's like also working and trying to juggle like all these things at once, right? So it can be that kind of situation. It can be a situation where your emotional state or your thoughts or the things that you say trigger a certain emotional or stress or traumatic response in a caregiver, and they get angry or they get frustrated or they get saddened by it. But you get some sort of message that my authentic kind of needs and desires, it's not safe to just express that because it's going to damage this relationship with my primary caregiver. And when given those choices, we will always go for the attachment when we are younger, because we need that caregiving, right? We need to be taken care of because we are so vulnerable at that point. So if they are in opposition to each other, we will choose the attachment. And this is often where you will see that, and I see this a lot in clinicians, including myself, right? And I'll show you, I'll go into like a little bit of an example in my life, how that kind of showed up. But essentially we not only feel very disconnected from like, what do I even need? What do I want? We have a very, we almost live for other people's needs. We live to kind of fix other people, to save other people. And there's almost like this, they call it in some circles like self-abandonment. So kind of losing yourself, losing a strong sense of identity, or losing a sense of connection with yourself, or knowing what you need or desire, or what your boundaries are, all of those things. So just kind of a loss of self and a loss of authenticity, feeling like you can't just be yourself. Because, firstly, who even am I? But also it feels unsafe to just be vulnerable, to be yourself, to talk about your needs. So I think this is one that's quite common. And in my family, this kind of showed up more as like when I was younger. And again, this is not blaming my parents. This can be completely not their intention. But essentially the message that I got was that when I am quiet, when I am not needing things, when I am not rocking the boat, when I am helping, that is when I get the love and the approval and all of that. And it was never the case that I would be like abused or something bad would happen if I wasn't that. But there was a very clear sort of hierarchy of like, this is what is lovable about you, and we don't want the other stuff, right? So even just praising certain good qualities, we automatically know that the opposite would then not be accepted. Or not be encouraged, or maybe I would receive less love if I did these other things. And so we keep repeating the behaviors that we perceive as this is getting me love and attention. All right, so it can be something like that, where you learn those behaviors, and what I sort of learned with that is that is my role in life, right? Like I exist to make other people happy, to make them feel comfortable, to help them with their problems, right? And there was almost like there was no connection to myself and no acknowledgement of my own needs. That was very much kind of suppressed, or not even like, I don't need anything, right? So yeah, I'm aware of that in myself, but I also see it a lot with clinicians. So just realizing that a lot of this is kind of learned responses from our childhood or from the early days, and knowing that those two sort of competing or can be competing things, those two things that we need, the authenticity and we need the attachment, if those two things seem to be in opposition with each other, we're always going to choose the attachment. So if you feel as a clinician that your authenticity and your kind of needs and desires are not, or have been kind of suppressed, or you've just kind of ignored that, that is a possible reason why that might be the case. So we can always look at like what, and again, not blaming, but what did I learn about the way that the world works when I was younger? What did I learn is good, right? What did I learn I will get love for and acceptance for and praise for, right? Those are the things we're going to be repeating. Okay, awesome. So I hope that was helpful. And yeah, I will post some of those resources, but I think just in general, we just want to be more aware as clinicians about how this can affect not only us, because we need to be aware of our own trauma responses and our own stress responses, especially when a patient is triggering us, that we know where that is coming from and we explore that a bit further. And then also, like I said, being a bit more aware of it and how that can influence our patient care and just our understanding of our patients as well. So yeah, have a great afternoon and I'll chat to you guys soon.